few months back, a young man who had been essentially just discovering the manosphere, say, been perusing it for about a year, had gotten into contact with me. And we had an interesting conversation. He'll obviously stay anonymous. Needless to say, he was in his late teens, just started university, and he wanted to talk to me about relationships and women and my thoughts on this because he had discovered my channel, hadn't seen quite everything, and wanted to pick my brain. And I acquiesced this request. And after having this conversation, the details of which I'll go into in a bit, I thought it might be instructive and useful to talk about, in generalities, what we discussed and how it applies to younger men today. Now, of course, there are sectors of young men, so-called FAs, incels, what have you, that don't have access to women or females. But in this young gentleman's case, he was above average in looks and height, but personality-wise, for better or worse, was never the type to actively pursue women. In fact, he's quite interested in his subject matters. He was studying both history and economics and was interested in the convergence of both, etc., and is quite focused on that. And also, based on my impression, interested in a wide variety of subjects. Very cerebral, very removed. I wouldn't say socially awkward necessarily, but just not terribly interested. Perhaps introverted would be the best way to put it. And that year, he told me he decided to take the plunge and somehow get involved with a girl that he knew that he was reasonably sure had some interest in him. And he was a bit surprised by the emptiness and hollowness of the so-called relationship or the dalliance that he had. And upon the surprise, he reflected on it and really couldn't find the words. And so this was the time which he turned to me, essentially, and I did my best to break it down. I'm not him, and I don't give advice. But I think oftentimes we don't step back and think about what things actually are. We don't break them down to their constituent parts. But relationships, particularly when you're a young man, can be generally broken down to their constituent parts. And if I'm frank, they ain't that special. Generally speaking, as you know, when you're a young man, you're driven by your hormones. And the way relationships work at that age, for both men and women, is that attractiveness and attraction is the single most important mediating factor, and it drives everything. It drives everything later too, but there are other factors involved. So when you're in your late teens, early 20s, whether or not you're attractive to someone, male or female, that is the primary factor involved. And if you think about that, just how primordial that is, you'll also realize that it doesn't map very well onto the modern world, if you think about it. Our ancestors lived very short, brutish lives. There's also some evidence to suggest that back then they weren't terribly attractive in general. That is to say, the standards of beauty and attractiveness we have today are much, much greater because people in general are more attractive than they used to be. But they lived short and brutish lives. There were not tons of criteria involved in selecting a mate. There weren't that many mates to go around. But we're still more or less driven by this. We see somebody attractive, we might be interested in them. Now, the primordial nature kicks in, and I'll bring it back to this young man's story, when you realize that that is not a lot to go on. So in his case, there was this pretty girl that was interested in him, and he's not completely immune to his hormones, obviously, and decided to give it a go. She was in his history class. And after a few months, he realized that something was amiss. Something just wasn't really there. He realized, for example, that he couldn't really talk to her about much of anything beyond the banalities of daily life. Would you like to go to the cinema? Maybe. Do you like that movie? Maybe. Let's go out and eat. Let's cook food. Really, really simple, basic bone stuff. But when it came to his interests, the things that drove him passionately to some degree, he could not converse with her, despite her seemingly attending this history class. And he realized during his dalliance/brief relationship that this issue was a constant. His inability to communicate to her, her lack of interest in his interests, and in general, her lack of interest in him, apart from, I guess, his looks, his pee-pee, and his height. And it struck him as odd, and eventually he ended the relationship/dalliance, much to her chagrin. I guess she was happy. But it sort of gave him the realization that all those years, he's not that old, but the years prior, say in high school, when opportunities had arisen and he did not take an interest in them, that he wasn't really missing out. Or his question to me was this in fact the exception? Did I just have bad luck here? Well, let me go back to my original point. Primordial drives, our interest in the opposite sex, predicated almost entirely on attractiveness, is not a very good long-distance runner, so to speak. So you get together with someone, they're attractive, and then what? Then you realize you have nothing in common. And for the record, men and women rarely have much in common. They don't have common interests typically. They don't have common approaches to life typically, etc., etc. So that's already a barrier. Never mind the other things. You're basing the entry into this relationship solely on looks. And we all do that to some degree. It's all based on attractiveness. But that cannot sustain what we call modern relationships, because you end up in a vicious cycle. And if he had continued down this path, he would have noticed this too. I think, based on my last communication with him, that he decided to abstain, at least for the time being. So what's the problem with just using your primordial instinct, your attraction to somebody, as the reason for a relationship? Well, presumably you don't want to inseminate them right away, so that's not a particularly good reason. And then you realize that you have nothing in common. You can't discuss things. You can't talk about anything. It just comes down to the basics. Maybe the sex is good, okay, but that can't sustain things long term. And then the hormonal magic dies off, and then you're really wondering why you're together with this person. And you might gravitate towards thinking about other people. Think, oh, that person's attractive, because you need variety or whatever. But all boils down to the same thing. Attractiveness as a primary factor for initiating relationships is not a good long-distance runner, and women and men typically have very little in common. And it's not that he was shocked by this. He had some information from the manosphere, and he had observed other people he knew. It's just that he wanted to know for sure if this was the reality he would face henceforth. And I told him, and this is just my view, that most relationships are like that. You have that initial force of attraction, you get together, and there's absolutely nothing outside of that to sustain it. No common interest, no common way of communicating, nothing. Nothing beyond that attraction factor. And so it goes. Now, in former times, the reality of the environment and the harshness that environment imposed on people forced people to cooperate and stay together. No longer the case. And so, to the younger men out there, this question of whether or not relationships, if they're accessible to them, are really worth the squeeze is a very relevant one. Now, obviously, this is directed towards reflective men who aren't necessarily being led primarily by their organs, so to speak, who don't think about this at all. Because I know cases of men who were young, who allowed themselves to be led by their peepees and ended up in absolutely horrific situations. One man in his early 30s, in fact, comes to mind. A gentleman who found an attractive woman, ended up in a long-term relationship with her, and then reproducing with her, not once, but twice. And it turns out they don't get along at all. They have completely different views of the world. And she's also hostile and threatens to take away his kids. They're not officially married, but they might as well be. All because he was following his instincts. Pretty girl, good enough. So what I'm saying here is not that men, and specifically younger men, should or should not pursue relationships, but the attraction factor, as important as baseline as it is to virtually every human being, cannot sustain anything. If you can't talk to a person, have an interesting conversation, you're not going to want to spend time with the person, because the magic of hormones will shut down at some point in time. And then what are you left with? A completely irreconcilable situation where neither person can relate to each other. Sound familiar? It should, because that is the state of most relationships between men and women of all ages, but above all in the younger brackets with the new generation, Generation Z. So there might be some men that have no problem with that. Maybe they don't have particular interests that they want to pursue or share with women. But that inability to communicate, that inability to even relate, is a profound obstacle for a lot of men, specifically younger men. And in the case of this one gentleman, made him realize that the juice really was not worth the squeeze. Not to completely shut out the possibility of him or men like him pursuing relationships. But the question I could relate to is, why even bother if that's the case? And then sometimes when we get caught up in our hormones and our admiration for the other person's looks, we over-attribute value to things they do and say. I can recall one instance that I might have mentioned publicly of a Korean ex of mine who at the time was quite pretty. She has hit the wall now, but nonetheless was in her early 20s and made this statement to the effect of observing a fountain running upwards as being a very Western thing versus Eastern architecture / fountains going with the flow. In of itself, not a dumb statement, but also not that profound. But at the time, mesmerized as I was by her looks, I thought, wow. I was younger and much more naive, of course. And we tend to do that sort of thing. But if young men and men in general are going to pursue relationships, it's going to be very, very difficult because attraction does not run the marathon for you. It also is long-term unstable because we all lose our looks too. So what's left there? I'm not sure there is a lot of common ground between men and women, broadly speaking. So unless you want to have children, raise a family, reproduce, yada, 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 the whole shebang, the absolute necessity of an alliance with a woman sort of goes out the window, because unless you just need to get your rocks off occasionally, why bother? Because generally there won't be anything of substance there. No common worldview, no common interests, no ability to relate. Never mind some of the classics. You ask the woman or the girl why she likes you, and she retorts, because of the way you make me feel. He heard that one too, by the way. He had asked her, this young man, why she had taken such an interest in him, clearly based on physical appearance, obviously. But her answer was, oh, it's just the way you make me feel. Now, I've said publicly that that's a great yardstick, a great way of testing the waters. When you're together with a female for a while and that's what she tells you, that's telling you that she knows nothing about you. And to the extent that she does know something about you, she doesn't care about you or your substance or your thoughts or anything that's actually relevant aside from the feelings that she's receiving from you vis-a-vis her fuzzy hormonal connection. And that's just something you have to deal with. We're kind of damned if we do, damned if we don't. Attraction is the ultimate force in getting people together, and though it's necessary to keep people together, it also sucks at keeping people together, because getting together with someone just because they're attractive doesn't do very much in the way of anything else. Now, obviously, people go on dates, they get to know each other, but oftentimes they're trying to bypass massive differences, that is men and women, males and females, just to make something work because they find each other physically appealing. Personally, I could not support that position, but a lot of people do that. And so essentially what I wanted to do in this video was reiterate some of the points I made to him and offer the idea that you don't have to pursue those things if you don't want to. Now, he's free to do whatever he wants. He can go do another relationship if he so chooses, but it is optional, and he should know that, and that's the framework that he can and should operate in, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, gentlemen, those are some of my thoughts on a young man's dilemma, and more broadly speaking, the dilemma many young men face with regards to the opposite sex, and whether or not they should bother with it. Not advice, but just what I think. As always, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.